something slightly different in architectural visualization. And one of the benefits of visualization is that my slideshow here is largely images, beautiful images. So I know you've all come back from your Easter break, so it's hopefully not going to be too much of a taxing first lecture back in that sense. But yeah, thanks, Matt. I think that covers it well. I'm a UE alumni. I studied my Part 2 architecture a few years back. And since then, I've been sort of moving through various different career paths associated with architecture. So workshop fabrication was something I did for a while. I've worked in practice, studying, practicing pure architecture. And then now sort of looking in and focusing in on architectural image making as a sort of a niche part of our profession. So yeah, I work for a company called Davidson, which was the first CGI image making studio in the UK. It was founded 30 years ago by a man called Alan Davidson, who sadly passed away in 2018 with motor neurons disease. But being the first and being one of the pioneers of the industry, we've seen a lot of change over the years, and how the production of artwork for architects and developers has shifted, and technology has played such a huge part in that shift. And I kind of want to position this talk as a conversation in a way about what are the core fundamentals of image making, because as a profession, I'd say there's a lot of kind of established connotations of how these sorts of images come to pass, how they come to be, and lots of stereotypes of sort of blue sky thinking and unrealistic scenes. And I think that it's quite important to look at visualization as a part of the contemporary design process of bringing the building from conception into the built environment. Quite often, rendering and image making is used as a tool for experimentation and critique and review. Many of the wonderful practices that we work with use it almost as a sort of a design tool to, as I say, review and critique their designs and establish the design principles moving forward. So I position this talk just as a bit of a conversation starter. As I say, I'm going to talk about some of the core fundamental aspects of visualization, art fundamentals, we might call them, things like composition, light, color, materiality. And I'm hoping this will sort of consolidate this as a process of interpretation rather than replication, that there is a sense of reviewing the information given to us and reviewing it using the fundamentals that I'm going to talk about in order to tell a story about how that architecture might be conceptualized, how the functions of the building are shown, and also how we can kind of craft a perceived aesthetic or beauty through the medium of images. So yeah, let's start with this quote. This is by the founder, Alan Davidson. He said, "Technology is merely a tool. It's secondary to the people using it." And I think that's something which is probably what I'm driving at here, is that in today's world with advancements in technology, it's so easy. It's so easy to produce an image right now with software such as Lumion. It's plug and play pieces of software that give you kind of an instant rendered result. And I think what I'm kind of getting at is how important it is to consider this the agency of the artist within that process to sort of interpret and imagine and in a sense speculate what that space might be. So this is us. We're a team of around 30 artists, architects. There are ceramicists in our team. There are 3D product designers, there's a anthropologist. We're a mixed bunch, and we draw upon quite a vast range of experience in order to do what we do. We're usually based in a wonderful studio in Paddington, in London, and it's a purpose-built studio for making artwork. It's an absolutely amazing space to show clients and throw parties in. It's actually an old abandoned car garage and was once a recording studio for Peter Gabriel, so it's quite an interesting space. But of course now with COVID, we're spread far and wide. So across the UK, we have team members in Italy, in Canada, in Russia, and further afield. So yeah, so times have changed a lot, but the sort of core principles that we were founded on are still there. So our studio culture is something that's very important to us. We're constantly pushing to innovate and develop, expand the knowledge within the studio base through sort of internal seminars and talks, outreach to different universities, such as how this event today came into being. And it's probably worth saying that we're also an EO company, which means we're 100% employee owned, which is really great. It ties in really well with having that agency as an artist and us all producing work individually, but collectively we share this group of values which originate with us. You know, as an employee owned company, we sort of we're sort of allowed to direct the conversation of who we want to work with and how we operate. So that's great. So things have changed a lot in this last 30 years, and it's probably worth saying that, you know, as technology has shifted, things have moved a lot more from the kind of an analog response to visualization through to a lot more of a digital workflow, but those sort of core practices are still evident. It's not really a new field, to be honest. Back in Renaissance times, sort of the advent of perspectival drawings, there's a long history of sort of the projected view of the architectural design preceding the built form, and I think it's quite important to just recognize that and remember when we show off some of the new technologies and things that I'm going to show you today. So primarily as a studio, we're making 2D image work, and although we've expanded on that, that's probably what I'm going to focus on today, is more like kind of 2D principles. On the screen here is a bit of a consolidated summary of what we do in the studio. So when I'm coming into visualization and making artwork, I was considered that it was just about glossy blue sky thinking renders, and it didn't really have that kind of range of different image styles and typologies. But we do sort of focus on two main fields, which is kind of the creative side of work, and also that of planning. Especially in the City of London, planning plays a huge part in terms of showing various developers, showing planning councils how that building, the form that building will take, and what those materials will actually look like in real life, and also the scale and the impact that city has on the building has on the city. And then also, as I say, we've more and more expanding into these new sort of realms of representation, such as augmented reality and virtual reality, which is really sort of pushing the boundaries in a way on how we might inframe space, inframe the design, so that it can be represented in a way that kind of proposes the kind of the poetry and the design of the space. So I will touch on some of that at the end, but I'm going to focus on the 2D work. So yeah, primarily I'm going to talk about image making here. And we might see this as a bit of a linear timeline of core fundamentals. So references, composition, light, materiality, narrative. And I'll just break down some of these different elements and use some examples of our work and some photographic references, sort of illustrate these points. So what we'll always start off with is reference imagery. And to draw a parallel, this is sort of similar to how we might look at precedent projects. And just as in architecture school, it's not just simply an exercise of showing that you've done it, but it's about unpacking the information within this work and forming a critique on what is working and what the image is trying to say. A reference image is a very powerful tool to review how the light hits the different faces of the architecture, how the materials, light, shadow, and how the materials sort of use light and shadow, so we can see the different detail in there, how they communicate the architecture to the viewer, but also showing information about people in the scenes and how users are interacting with the buildings. So this is I've got a couple of different examples from some of prominent architectural photographers here. So this is Laurent Cronenthal, French photographer based in Paris. And what we can unpack from this image is, in a sense, trying to sidestep the unconscious bias that we have towards artwork. And what I mean by that is, when we're very young and we sort of learn the form of the house, the kind of monopoly house. If someone, all through life, someone might tell us, will you draw a house? And many, I mean, obviously students of architecture will know better and they won't anymore, but many people will draw that same house that they learned when they were young. And we can do the same thing with design work, whether or not it's in architectural visualization or in architectural design itself. When you're not looking out into the world with eyes wide open and drawing inspiration from what already exists, you're designing from your head, from that subconscious bias, and applying all of those rules, which isn't always necessarily a bad thing, but most of the time, and this is true for many architectural renderings from different companies, it equates to that kind of blue sky falseness that we see, where we're sort of imagining this reality that could never exist. So architectural photography as a point of reference is wonderful for sort of identifying those moments of either the sublime, in this case, of where we're using a snapshot of human activity in order to compose the images. It can be material, like I said, about light. And what's more, it doesn't necessarily need to be architectural photography at all. It can be references from print medium, it can be from artwork, it can be from illustrations. So it's a vast area, and I think it's very important when we first look to how we're producing images to be able to hone in on something that can inspire us and inspire our clients. So here we have a couple of different reference mood boards for a few of the various projects in our studio. And you can see how the tone of the images, the kind of the contrast, the atmospheric qualities are very different between these three. We might think the first is from like an editorial magazine, Davidson, etc. Whereas the central mood board is a lot more cinematic. We might draw a lot of inspiration from moving image and film work here, which is going to give the image set a very different look and feel, as it would in a bit more of an atmospheric or kind of climactic mood board there in the last one, in terms of that winter sort of palette of color and cool shades. So to tie that to a project, I'll just very quickly show you this St. Mary Abbott's Place in Kensington, which is a very rich conservation area. And this image was produced as a part of the planning consent. So it's illustrative planning, but all the same, it was packaged up within the application in order to be able to, illustrate how the building is sensitive to its context. And you can see how the architecture itself, how the rhythm of the roof line continues from its context, and how the color of the material specified is sympathetic to the area where it is around. This was the sort of the mood board, the palette of reference imagery that was investigated for this project. And you can see here that those tones, those sort of autumnal tones, when you start to compare them to other images, perfectly valid images of architecture, great photographs that have this kind of more stark, contrasty, cool tones to them, it almost seems quite aggressive when you see them next to it. You can imagine that if we presented an image to London Council of the scheme using these kind of harsh colours, like the kind of impact that might have had on the overall effect of the planning application. And then as the final point, and again, sort of linking through to that unconscious bias, looking at reference imagery allows us to critique how the materials and how the light works within the space in a way that we wouldn't be able to do without it. So this little breakdown here of sort of showing up the layering of the imagery. All of these tweaks were made in response to trying to bring that raw render, which was very basic and hopefully inspires you somewhat, because it does show that not everything needs to be like super technical and resolved. Each little adjustment is made in reaction to how the photograph works in real life. So in order to be able to get to that level of sort of realism, or to be able to convince in a certain way, it's really important to be able to really hone in on that in the images. So the next part of the process is composition, which I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with, some terms such as rule of thirds or the golden ratio, etc. But for me, composition is one of those parts of the process where if you get this right, the rest is relatively simple and falls into place, whereas a poor composition will always be the shortcoming of whether or not that image can properly capture a sort of a mood or evoke a certain emotion. So just drawing on a bit of an example here, this is Paul Panisheko. This was, I think, the Architectural Photographer Image of the Year a couple of years back or something like that. But yeah, this is an incredible example of how various different geometrical elements in the scene all combine, so that when we view the image, our eyes are led but not forced, and how the different sort of geometries within the scene, the light and shadow, sit harmoniously in order to bring the image together. So we can look, if we squint our eyes, we almost see like a perfect 50-50 balance of light and dark from left to right of the image. The sort of the shaft of light that's coming down both at the back of the image and in the midground, both lead us through to a single protagonist. The color, we've got this really harmonious sort of complementary relationship between cool and warm tones in the image, help to sort of offset that kind of central point and that focus. And that's all of those things I've just talked about can be even more evident in a composition such as this, where we've got almost something quite graphical. This is a photograph, which is quite amazing, by Joe Fletcher. And that leading of lines through to a central point, what's around the corner, also starts to elicit sort of a narrative and scene of like what might be around that corner. It starts to lead you into the image. But then it's kind of the symmetry as well between high saturation and almost zero saturation, light and dark as well, causes this kind of, again, 50-50 harmony between the top and the bottom. So really amazing work. So this is, again, we're looking to images like this when we're sort of inspired by compositional studies. So the last one here, this is a really beautiful image by Anthony Coleman, one of my favorites. So I think this, in terms of composition, brings so many elements together. It's got really incredible geometric forms within the image. And what I like about it is it captures that sort of the element of the sublime. So this moment with this girl with the hula hoop, sort of where she starts to enframe the building, or the triangles, the sort of ziggurat form of the roof. And also how that then sits perfectly on this diagonal cut where the staircase cuts through the image. So Yeah, I mean, you wouldn't come up with this on your own. It's a response of real life, and I think that's why it's so important to be looking at other images. So this is an example of a compositional study that we've done within the studio. This is Mountbatten House by FCB. This was commissioned as a set of 8 images. It's a creative reuse project, and for it, we probably did over 100 examples of different camera options in order to sort of pinpoint and hone in on the 8 chosen in the end. And it's a really nice example because the aspect ratio of the square frame, as well as the positioning of the camera perpendicular and at 45 degrees to the architecture, is a way that, as a sort of a digital photographer, if you will, we've responded to the design of the forms and shapes that the building presents. So once we've done that exercise, we then might start to consider that composition by how light enters the space and starts to form its own geometries. So it's really important for us that once we've sort of interrogated the geometrical forms, then you have to review it again at different times of year to see what you can uncover. We might start to consider ourselves as sort of the first user of the space, which is quite exciting. Architecture is not sort of designed in a vacuum, so this sort of filters down into sort of using rendering as a design tool. Most of the time we send these sort of minimized chalk renders over to the architects. This is by and large often the first time they've seen their building brought to life, which is usually quite an interesting conversation. It's usually at this stage that quite a lot of edits get made to the architecture. But yeah, it's a journey of sort of discovery and speculation as we move around. So this here is the sort of one of the final end output images for this project. It's a real favorite of mine. I think what is successful about it, as I referred to the sort of the squares and 45-degree sort of chamfers of the building, we found this very curvaceous staircase that the architect had designed. They'd not commissioned this view, but I think when we showed it to them, they were sold. And I personally, my favorite part of this image is where the light hits the floor. So we get that kind of perfect dark band at the bottom, which allows the staircase to be framed in the square box, just as it is in plan. Yeah, it's sort of the product of that rigor of interrogating. So lighting, another really key, core and fundamental part of producing imagery. Lighting is very closely related to the emotional response that it triggers. As I mentioned before, with the kind of the cool and the cool tones mixed with the kind of warmer yellow light, the kind of inviting response that we have to warm light as opposed to the cool light is a very powerful tool we can use in our image making. So this is Edmund Sumner. This is the Inagawa Chapel by David Chipperfield. This is exactly the same framing, same composition, but with 2 different sources of light, or 2 different lighting rigs. And the second image, of course, is the more like the natural found lighting, very soft, kind of bleeding light into the space. And later on, a sort of dusk shot, we've got a mix of the kind of implemented lighting from that kind of glow over the door. So just be able to consider how lighting can completely change the mood feel of an image is very important. So using those principles, this is one of our images. This is Maggie's in Taunton by Alison Brooks Architects, and we're probably all very aware of the end use of the Maggie's Centre. It's all about nurturing, it's about care, and we've used those principles of light, dark, but also in lighting warm and cool tones to sort of build up a very simple scene, whereby a few sort of simple, warm, very warm, glowing fill lights on the interior, and a very soft sort of long shadowed but low intensity sunlight can create a really nice balance between that warm interior protective environment and also not a harsh exterior environment, but in terms of color and that kind of perceived emotion, it feels as if it is a kind of a much cooler and harsher exterior to interior. So that last example, if that's a very simple lighting setup, this one here might be contrived to be a very complicated one. This is a competition we worked on for Tintagel Bridge down in Cornwall, which is now built. And the reference imagery we found for it in the centre really gave us the sense of that powerful kind of end of day dusk lighting, lots of high contrast, and really added to the sort of the majesty of the way of how that feels to be down in that place. Whereas the supplied photography from the competition organisers was almost the total opposite. We had a backlit scene whereby the island was all lit, so there was red, absolutely no contrast from left to right, and also we had the cliff line itself was causing a shadow over the island, so it was problematic. And the way we got around that was by effectively relighting the scene by remodeling the island, and I'll show in the next slide after this sort of build up here how we managed to do that. But it's a way we've managed to use lighting to our advantage in order to achieve the kind of required outcome. So how we did that was by forming a bit of a 3D model of the island and then projecting the supplied photography as a texture over that surface. And then as that was in 3D, it would allow us to relight the scene as we chose from the right and create that contrast. This is a final example, and this is a bit more of a commercial project. But quite often, architects, or more likely developer clients or pressures from developer clients, will want to see their buildings in the blue sky with all the lights on, with everyone happy. And it's all the stereotypes that we're trying to sort of combat with this criticality of the architecture itself. And one way we've found a way of getting around that is by perhaps changing the time of day and using light to our advantage. So in this example, light hits the top of the building, which allows the bottom, where they wanted to show that kind of the hive of activity and the warm glow, allows that to be in shadow. Because in reality, what you get is when the building is lit, you have a lot of reflection. All the windows basically become like mirrors. They reflect the environment around them. If that environment is bright, then it's very difficult to be able to see through and in. So moving on to materiality. Materiality is a very powerful part of the process. I think it was David Chipperfield says it's materials that connect architecture with the real world. It connects us with the real world, and therefore to the architecture. And I think with the materials, we take a lot of pride in sort of developing them up to a very high standard, and not just simply because of it's the technology is there to do so, but it's about sort of embodying those kind of tacit qualities, the imperfections, and the kind of the marks from when they were installed or how they've weathered. When you include all of that in a building, it sort of tells a bit more of a story of how that building sits within the built environment and how it might be perceived to look in the years to come, embedded, if you will. So you might look at a shot like this, a little clipped frame of the building, sort of tell that story of how those materials interact with each other. How does the glass read? How does the reflection look within that glass? And then also the interaction between different materials, the different types of concrete. So in this example, the columns, for instance, how they meet with the floor plates and the dark shadows that are caused at that point. That we might see some sort of trails where the concrete has been visually has been altered by the environment over the course of time. And I think a shot like this, a clipped view of the architecture compositionally as well, can tell a lot about the sort of architectural intent there, often more so than when you show the whole building. So just thought I'd maybe do a tiny breakdown of just how those materials sort of come together, using an example here of the Avior residences in Tokyo. Excuse me. So yeah, we've got a small sort of clipped vignette here of just a sort of moment within the building with this light, sort of dappled light shining through these curtains. And it's a really nice little shot. We like to produce these sorts of images for architects, so they can get a sense of how that everything's sort of tied together within the different spaces. And the first step is to sort of generate something we might call a diffuse or a source color pass. And if you will, it's sort of like what the material would look like if there was no light or dark. Obviously, in that case, you wouldn't see it, but let's pretend for a moment. It's sort of, yeah, the information, the map without any shadows, without any highlights. And what it does is it allows you to sort of have an idea of when light hits that object, what kind of color might bounce off of it, what kind of texture might we read in the surface. It's on top of that where we could start to add these imperfection maps, which maybe is where the material starts to elevate. Is a sort of like a primer on physics. Probably all remember this, and if you don't, I'll try and summarize. But when we look at material, what we're actually seeing is the light bouncing off that surface and into our eyes. And effectively, a rougher surface is going to be less reflective because the light is getting trapped, or it's bouncing off in different directions away from your eye. So something like steel, stainless steel, or a mirror, glass, whatnot, have a very, very like linear surface, therefore an even reflection. And then something like a kind of concrete wall, for instance, is has a lot of imperfection in there, so we don't see all of that. And that's how we sort of read those different changes in surface. So what we do is we sort of plug in this sort of library of dirt maps and all sorts of different textures into the reflection layer and change and alter the way that we see that reflection. Black being no reflection, white being full. And this is how we can sort of add those kind of traces of interaction, I guess, from the making process or from the interaction from users, maybe. It's how we got the kind of the concrete stains on the wall in the previous images. Finally, I guess the third part might be to deform the surface itself, and that's in using like a bump map or a displacement map. If you've ever used these before, that's the displacement's the black and the bump is the purple maps. But what these effectively do is they give some more information on how that surface is shaped in 3 dimensions. So, for example, might be that bottom left one is like a scalloped roof tile. We can almost imagine like how that would curve, like the curvaceous form would start to build up. So yeah, this is just a very quick time lapse. I'll probably skip past this actually because it's quite long, but just showing how those buildings, how the materials build up within the scenes. And it's definitely a worthwhile process, especially in design projects, to sort of review and critique how some of these materials fit together and how they complement each other. You can sort of see me here building up the different layers of reflection and grime to produce little sort of vignettes like this. So that's more everything up to that point, setting the composition, the lighting, materiality. For me, these are all practices which sort of help to encapsulate what the architecture might actually be like physically. I've just seen a question come up. I'll probably just do some questions at the end, but I'll try and, Matt, if you wouldn't mind just reading those out to me at the end, that'd be great. Yeah, the last sort of step of the process is narrative. And I think we can look to different precedent images again and how we might understand narrative to work in an image, but everything up to this point would allow us to be able to encapsulate the architecture in a state of showing it in a way that exists. How truthfully and how accurately you want to represent that is up for debate. Sometimes we want to show our schemes like very resolved, very high detailed, almost photorealistic, which is a statement of showing exactly what they are envisaging and what they think the building will look like. And other times we want to show it in a bit more of an abstracted sense, where it's a bit more broad brushstroke. And I'll show some examples of that later. But narrative really starts to tie everything together and tells a story within the image. And it's the part where we can allow the viewer some agency to be able to interpret and understand what is actually going on in that building. So programmatically, we can start to sort of play off how that building is going to be used. And I've just got two images here by photographer Thomas Struth. It's quite excellent examples of how we might consider the placement of people, characters within our views, within architectural image making, in order to sort of lead the eye. So, image on the left, for instance, there are quite a few people in that scene, but our eyes, through color, through positioning, composition on the third, are drawn to this man in the red jacket, and we can almost follow his gaze up into the space, into the Pantheon, which is kind of represented in a way as just an empty volume, right? But then as we move up, either whether or not it's left or right, we circle back using the lines and the geometries back towards the other characters in the space until we end up back with the main character again. So just through composition in this way, Thomas Struth is able to sort of push us in the direction that he chooses in terms of viewing. Similarly, on the right, it's very intentional how there is no sort of central protagonist. We might consider the lady in the blue top in the foreground, the tan sort of chinos, as being the first point of entry into the image. But then by having all of the other characters wearing sort of bright, bold colours, various different locations in the scene, we start to actually wander around and seeing. I think I got quite a lot of feedback. I don't know if someone could just mute their mics or just force mute everyone. Okay, I'll carry on. Yeah, the various colours and small moments compositionally in the scene, our eyes are sort of forced to sort of wander around all of these moments, and it gives the room a sense that there is central focus. And this is also something that we can implement within the image making process. So these two images here, two of ours. Yeah, Matt, I don't know if it's possible just to force mute everyone because it's quite a lot of feedback. Yeah, the image on the left, we've got a single protagonist in the piece. Everything that's happening in the scene has been specifically to illustrate that narrative, whether or not or the kind of the tone of the light within the scene, but everything sort of draws back to that being a kind of quiet moment. On the right is taking more reference from Thomas Struth's earlier image, whereby we sort of generate and populate the image, lots of different individual moments and in the scene. And what that does is it allows us to sort of wander and create our own sort of stories that's happening in the view. If that was quite explicit in the previous slide, this slide sort of shows the power also of the implicit narrative, which is something implied within the image that might be happening or could be happening. So the image on the left, we see the reading book with some glasses on top there. Without that, the image is sort of static and doesn't necessarily present any kind of narrative, but with that, it invites the users to sort of fill in the blanks in a way. So we might start to, someone has been there, or they've just popped that book down and those glasses and they've just gone off to go and make a tea or a coffee. And it's within that the image starts to like gather some momentum as stuff is happening in that scene. Similarly, with the image on the right, this is David Chipperfield's Dunard Centre in Edinburgh. We've got this character staring outside of the windows and of a warm glow coming from inside the kind of concert hall. And it might seem on the surface that it's quite simple as to what's going on here. He's relaxing, but once you start to consider what he might be doing, or whether, you know, he could be a performer that's sort of stepped out after a practice session, or maybe he's a guest and he's waiting to go in. We don't know. You can't know. You've sort of got to start filling in the gaps. And I think that can be a really powerful part of the process if you can embody that within the views. So yeah, finally, in terms of the image making, it's also worthwhile considering the sort of end output. In university, obviously, all of the images we produce for our sort of pin-ups, etc., sort of show the building in a certain way. So this might be not as relevant, but commercially, considering where that product might go, whether or not it's being printed in a publication such as the AJ, or on a website such as I say, Dazine, or if it's for a competition like the central sort of images there, how a set of images work together, the color and light, and how they might appear on a composition board is something that's very important to consider from the beginning, that there's a sort of a central theme, as if a photographer might have gone there on one day and captured the set. And then finally, we might also consider how that image might work into a bit more of a lifestyle magazine, or something like Serial, for instance, and what requirements or demands does that have on the kind of the tones in the images, the colors. You know, quite often when I think of those kind of more painterly shots, I think of the raised blacks, sort of where the shadows never really get that dark. And yeah, this is a sort of an example of how one of our projects has sort of catered to that end aesthetic of the more of the serial magazine, lifestyle magazine type view. So this is some of our image planning. You can see almost the whole process of what I've talked about today brought into a document. We have our reference images, sort of the idea as to what that shot might look like, and all laid out in a kind of editorial composition. So that's a sort of a bit of a broad overview of what goes into the making of architectural imagery. Here's Davidson. I think I'm just going to use this last little bit of time to sort of unpack some of the other stuff that we're working on, which is really exciting. So for me, this sits really well in that using these tools, these rendering engines and materiality as a critical tool. Doesn't have to be used in the kind of more let's say time old traditional sense of CGI as being photoreal. Quite often now with architects and designers, we're trying to figure out ways of using them in alternative means, alternative forms of representation in order to present ideas differently, which is really exciting. So here's a couple of different shots for Article 25. They run an annual charity auction to raise funds for their endeavours in Africa. And we produce sort of printed medium for them every year, images to sell off for them for that cause. We might also consider what might call a happy accident, which is sort of all the offcuts and tangent results of the overall process. It's really important not to miss these at times, because similarly to how we might learn from a reference image of a photographer that we admire, we might also look to these sort of happy accidents to sort of inspire us to take an image in a different direction. And I would definitely encourage you to experiment a lot with these different pieces of software and see what can you formulate, because most of the time the kind of standard output is rarely what's interesting. That sort of led us to experimenting with these more hybrid styles, which are really in vogue right now. So this is that kind of more posterized, cutout, textured kind of image, and we can produce this by stripping out all of the kind of ray traced elements and reducing it back down to more kind of blocks of light and dark over the flat textures. Just on that, this is a project that we've been working on in Tanzania for Article 25 again. This is all produced in Unreal, which is sort of relatively new to the field in some respects, but it's a gaming engine, and it's for a children's orphanage. So the end output of this was to show to them as to what's, show to the children as how the space might look and feel, but not necessarily in a hyper-real sense. So I hope you can hear this, but it's a small video of how that's come together. Okay, so moving on to sort of final slides here. I think Matt shared this in an email prior, but just wanted to sort of show this to you all. This is a sort of an app that we've been working on over the last year, which is trying to really expand on how we might show off our images, or how people might interact with them. It's available, unfortunately, only on iOS at the moment. But if you scan this barcode, you can find it online. But what it effectively is it's turning printed work or work that you can see on a screen into an animation, which is embodied in the app. So got some examples here, but if any of you have downloaded the app, you might want to give this a go now. I can't see any of you, it's probably worth saying, so I'll just give it a moment.
Nick, just so you know, the audio worked fine, and I've got the app open. It was shared by Sophia earlier, and if you swipe across and you point them at the two images, you start to see them animate. Amazing. Yeah, so this is definitely something I'm interested in. Is sort of expanding on how people can interact with image work in the built environment. I don't have it here because I can't share it yet, but I'm working on a sort of a Unreal virtual reality project for a learning center in northern India, in Udaipur, whereby the whole project has been shifted into a virtual reality experience. And then within the virtual reality, you can do this and look at different parts of the building, and it will animate and bring up images, still images and moving image of those parts of the building. So yeah, it's definitely drawing into the conversation how the traditional form of capturing architecture and the principles that I've talked about here today are ever shifting, and the demands that more of these immersive technologies are having on those. I will come back to this slide at the end, so if you haven't had a chance to play with it, you can. But I thought I'd just sort of close things up here on
the image on what I'm presenting, just to talk about how everything I've displayed here today, all these principles also operate to a larger extent in moving image. So we do a lot of animated film work, which has its own requirements and its own demands. So you can see here sort of a sequence, an image sequence, or a storyboard of how that might come to pass. Obviously, it's very, very different to going out and filming in the real world. You can't just endlessly have the camera rolling, because all of the different sequences are have to be composed in a very rigorous manner and be rendered out. So there's a lot stressing the importance on being able to direct a sequence and how the kind of space is experienced through that. But yeah, I've just got a little show reel here showing some of this project in Vancouver by Kengo Kumar, but also mixed in with some of our other animation work. So I'll play that for you now. Perfect. I hope that was played smoothly enough. I know there's quite a lot of issues, isn't there, with tie-in with Zoom and all these kind of online meetings, but hope it gives you a sense. Yeah, so last slide. Ordinarily each year we run a summer placement, which is a really wonderful program where we take on a few students into our Paddington studio and sort of teach them the whole process from beginning to end and how to use all the software. And it's a really fantastic experience. But alas, for COVID, we're not going to be able to run it this year. But in place, we are going to be running a series of sort of webinars and image making workshops. So the details of these are to be confirmed at the moment, but I'll share an email address, this one on the screen at the moment, with Matt to circulate. If any of you are interested, we'll probably just host a sort of Zoom call and review things like portfolios. We might review any artwork for portfolios and just try and direct that. Could be quite a good tool for kind of compiling and readying for applying for jobs. So excellent. Thanks so much, everyone. I know I had some questions come up. I'm not sure if I can access them right now, but yeah, I'll just leave these images on the screen in case you want to have a play around with the app. And yeah, let's take questions.
Thank you, Nick. That was a really, really amazing talk. I find it kind of fascinating, this kind of slight tangent to the practice of architecture and the sort of way, the nuances that come up within these images. Kind of absolutely amazing. I mean, I personally was fascinated by the two images on the screen, possibly not maybe in the way that they're used. I will ask I've seen Laura's asked a question. I will come back to that in a second. but maybe on what other sort of forms of representation you might overlay on this. So if you, but whether it's a sort of thinking process, the sort of design process that could be sort of played into this, as well as the sort of operation of the space, is kind of just very interesting, that sort of animation of the drawing. It's something that a lot of the students have that are here today have been working on sort of expanded surface drawings, which are a sort of a derivative of an idea of the developed surface, and some of them have sort of played with techniques, but not necessarily attached them to the drawing in the same way. But really, really amazing.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's just lots of stigma or whatnot about using rendering engines for end outputs, which is something I think needs to be considered or critiqued. Rendering engines is a generative process, but you put in an input and you'll get an output, and you can use those in so many different ways, like whether or not you redraw the output or you use it to test shadows that can be then superimposed or overlaid. But I mean, these are just ideas, but as a tool for sort of design experimentation, using these technologies leads to some very interesting conversations and very interesting ideas. And I mentioned, I mean, more in the commercial sense, architects will sort of use this to review their designs, often make edits and changes afterwards. But through the design process as well, you can use these engines and things to test out different varying color dimensions and different compositions and pairings of materials, etc. So, I mean, we do need to consider these as tools for generating design as well as just simply showing the end product.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing and I think this goes into maybe Laura asked, what programs and software do you use? But I think that it's that sort of dissemination of these programs into Hayes Davidson, obviously being 30 or 40 years of experience in this area. A lot of these tools are becoming quite heavily disseminated. I mean, and things like Unreal Engine are becoming more accessible to anybody, in the same way that perhaps film has become a lot more sort of, or the access to the media at least has become a lot more sort of available, and how we can harness this, and I guess processing power enabling us to do these things quickly, how we can actually start to use these in a quicker way, because I mean, a decade ago, I could never render anything like this. But when I would render something, I could remember rendering things for 3 days, leaving them in a computer and just having to have multiple computers. And
exactly. And things have changed so much. There's technologies out there now that can do this almost instantly. And I think that's probably why it's worthwhile sort of investigating this a bit more, especially for students producing renders and producing images of their buildings to critique the various elements that go into it. This is not a process of creating carbon copies or replicas of the information that we put in. It's not just to show it exactly as is. All these different sort of themes that I've referred to today is all about kind of crafting and curating how that image is to be interpreted, and how, like, sort of evoking an emotion and a feel within there. In terms of what software we use, I mean, primarily, yes, 3ds Max and the kind of unfortunately named Corona renderer is what we're sort of using in the studio. But Matt, you're totally right. We're using the right piece of software for the right job. So whether or not we're going to jump into a different piece of software such as Blender or Unreal for a different task, sort of as the quote said at the beginning, it's kind of irrelevant, because most of the software we're using now probably isn't going to exist in 25 years' time. So it's sort of, using what we need to get the job done.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions. Kiana asked if you could share the email. Nick can share it with us, and we can send it via the same chain that you got the invite, or Nick can type it in here on the chat.
Yeah. It's just summer@hayesdavidson.com. And if you email through there, you'll get put on a sort of a mailing list. So when we do pin down on our sort of webinars and reviews, we can send you an invite to that.
No spaces in Hayes Davidson, is it at all?
Yeah, no spaces.
Brilliant. Okay, I have got my glasses on. That doesn't make much difference. And then Joe asked, with 4 weeks left, what are 3 of the most important things you recommend doing to ensure we produce beautiful images for our portfolio? Joe knows already how to make beautiful images for his portfolio. We saw that last year, but focusing on composition, I imagine, before being one of them.
Sure, yeah. I think focusing on what's important to the project primarily, and don't worry too much about achieving a certain level of finish or quality. To put things into perspective, some of the images that I've shown you today, on average, they take about a week per image, and that's with all of the power and tools that we have at our disposal. So I would probably say don't worry too much about trying to recreate something like that in an architectural project at university. Although it is interesting to sort of aim towards it or work towards it if you have a passion for it. But focusing on the key moves of what your design intent is. So if there's a material within the building which is important to the scheme, then obviously focusing on that and spend a bit more time on it because it's clearly important to what you're trying to say in the wider picture. If there are other details then that kind of get lost along the way, or I don't say lost, but sidetracked to put on the back burner, so to speak, that's okay, so long as the core concepts are shown. And I would play around a lot with different styles of images. Look for precedent images online, look for references that you like and that embody the kind of visual style that the project is leading towards, and try and take notes and take cues from them. So for instance, in a lot of our hybrid image work, if I can find it, sort of this is a much faster process, and we're looking more at kind of collage artwork and sort of more traditional techniques of producing, like putting these images together, so that we're trying to subvert in a way and make it not too realistic, a bit more broad brushstroke, which most of the time is a lot more successful than trying to do something photo real in half the time without the end output. Any more?
There's not any more, but this image, when I saw it earlier, one of the things I find fascinating is obviously on the right it is a slight animation, or there's something very wrong with my eyes, and I kind of find it interesting the shifting medium that this is opening up, that with screens improving more and more, we choose to view images in this way rather than in a printed form, or and it opens up a different set of possibilities, and I guess that this goes down into things like contrast, that you can actually display them in a certain way, that replication, etc. I think that question of using it within consultation, do you come across the issues of, obviously with verified views with that, but when you're then not just a designer presenting something as a document to but then you're presenting it to the public, and you're somehow a mediator in that sort of process. Is there must be quite a heavy responsibility on trying to gauge what the architect is trying to push you, or potentially developers behind that, and then what it's actually like as an output, especially when it goes into a process where people are trying to make a decision on, particularly people who are not necessarily image literate within that process.
Yeah, sure. I mean, things are very different on the planning side of what we do. Planning is very meticulous. In the work we do, you mentioned sort of verified views and wirelines. We're currently developing an app at the moment whereby you can stand within the City of London and hold your phone up towards the development, and it will show you the kind of the wire line, the extent where that will be comparative to the city. But it's almost it's an exercise of technical prowess as opposed to an artistic venture, I guess you could say, because we're sort of standing back in a way on a piece of software like that. We're standing back from the conversation as to what the impact that building has on the city and purely representing it. In terms of how buildings are portrayed within these images, it's a hot topic, isn't it? Because often these buildings are portrayed poorly with, blue sky thinking, lots of trees all over the building, and things that just can't actually happen, which this industry is guilty for. But I think for me, it's really important that if an image like that is put out there, then it's highly stylized. Perhaps it's painterly, perhaps it's very atmospheric, because it's more about starting a conversation of what the intent for that building is, not showing it as realistic or as a real venture, or the output rather. I don't know if that answers the question, Matt.
Yeah, it does. It is. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, it's it's accuracy versus seduction, or something like that, isn't it? That's a question I missed was from Joe Hyatt, which was, can you recommend any good, ideally free resources we can go to?
I could list them off. I'm aware of time. Maybe if I just put a list together, Matt, and you could circulate it, might be quite good. I probably would say the best resources are those you can capture yourself. So as a bit of a blanket answer to that, but often when we'll do our work, we'll send photographers out to site to photograph the site with the right lens as well, composition and the right setup, camera height, etc. But also, more importantly, the correct time of day, time of year, in order to get the lighting to work for the scene. So in terms of a project, at university, if you have access to the site, and I do realise that it's been difficult this last year or so, but photographing it from the position that you're envisaging that view to work from, and then photographing people, say, if you have your camera on a tripod, and you click the shutter when people are moving through, use those. They're the best assets to use in the scene, because they are lifelike to the time of year, and they've got the attire, the lighting will be correct, etc. So yeah, I think that would be my top suggestion, but I will share some sort of asset websites as well. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, the final question, let's make this the final one from Monet, which is, what are your predictions of how VR experiences will be integrated into the process or experience of architectural design? It's a big question. Do you see people coming to expect a VR experience as part of pitches, or it being part of a set of tools to analyze, retrofit, or anything like that? Yeah,
definitely. Big question. And it's one that doesn't really have like a solid answer, I don't think, within the architectural sort of community right now, because it's such an emerging technology. Like, still finding new uses for virtual reality within these processes. We've started within ours, that image planning process at the very beginning of setting up compositions. We've started to experiment with how we might investigate a building using VR as a photographer in the space, capturing 2D views to then focus on as a 2D image, which is totally amazing that you can do that. But I think it will change stuff. And I think, again, it's, as I've sort of alluded to about remaining critical of the output, what is it actually trying to say? I think it will lead to more questions in that tangent, or in that line of inquiry, really, because what happens in an image when you in-frame it and you decide things, you make a series of artistic decisions on composition, the aspect ratio, the people, the narrative, all the things I've talked about. You sort of, every time you make that, you embody it in the image, and you're crafting a piece of art. And when you kind of take away the frame and you can look anywhere, you can look down and up and give the agency to the viewer as to how that's how the architecture is seen. It's not necessarily that you're going to give away all of that artistic embodiment, the composition, etc. You can still have that in the view, but the way you work that up and how you actually process that, there's always going to be parts of it that don't work, or are accidents, and therefore you're shifting the conversation more towards what does it feel like physically in the real sense, rather than how do I want this to feel. So yeah, I don't know, maybe that's a little bit more of a long-winded answer. But for instance, in that Udaipur project, one of the ways we're trying to sort of subvert that is by having augmented reality overlays within the building that imagine the building in a different way. So we'll see it in the sense of how it exists, but then, for instance, one of the overlays turns a large portion of the building into a living aquarium where there are sharks and fish floating around people's heads. And bearing in mind, this is a science and learning centre, so it's not completely irrelevant. But it's a way that we can sort of turn that virtual reality experience into something which is not supposed to be lifelike, as opposed to feigning that it is. Again, hard to answer that question. Great question, though.
Okay, with Leonie asked about permissions. We're done with regards to recording the talk. We just need to have permission for the images. So we have recorded it, but we may not release it. That's the only. Nick, that was really, really intriguing, very interesting, and yeah, so yeah, I was really inspired by it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me.
And see you back in the studio on Wednesday.
Will do. All right. See you guys.
Thank you.